verses 22 through 24. But the father said to his servants, "Bring forth the best robe, and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand, and shoes on his feet. And bring hither the fatted calf, and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this is my son was dead, and is alive again. He was lost, and is found." And they began to be merry.
Good morning. Good to see everyone here this morning. Grateful for your presence with us. Please stick around. Let us get to know you a little bit better and hope to see you again this evening at 6 o'clock when we meet for our second service. Society has been attacking men for a long time, haven't they? The position that men hold in the community, in their homes, they have been attacking and trying to belittle men and by extension fathers. To fulfill our God-given role as fathers is to be likened unto being misogynists, right? We think we are better than women. Children are being raised in fatherless homes now because fathers aren't needed. We don't need to have male figures, male authority figures helping to raise children. So now they're growing up lacking a masculine role model. Boys are growing into men not knowing their own responsibility, and the cycle repeats itself. The role of being a father is challenging. Anyone with children would attest to this. Being a father is a hard task at times. That's right. Chris, you can't say that yet. But God has given us direction. God has told us how to do our job. And who better to give us direction than the Father of all creation? He created everything. Wouldn't He have an idea of how we should act? And so today, being Father's Day, we're going to have a lesson on how to be a father. But we're going to use a source that I think is often overlooked when we talk about fathers. And that being the father of the prodigal son. Open your Bibles there to Luke chapter 15. Now, me and this PowerPoint had a talk this week. And it told me it was going to behave, so we're going to give it a shot, and we're going to see. I want us to look in Luke chapter 15, beginning in verse 12. And the younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me." So he divided to them his livelihood. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, journeyed to a far country, and there wasted his possessions with prodigal living. The younger son made a very uncommon request during that time. You did not go to your father and say, "Let me have my portion of the inheritance." Even today, that is frowned upon. If your father has a will, you don't go to him and say, "Hey, go ahead and hand over to me what you have willed to me." That's just disrespectful, to say the least. And yet this younger son does this. He goes to his father and he says, "Give me the portion that I am due." Seemingly, living under his father had become oppressive. Right? He did not want to stay under his father's roof anymore. The word here used for father is pater, or as you might say in East Tennessee, pater. And it carries with it the idea of one who nourishes, one who protects, one who upholds. You see, this father was doing his job in taking care of his family. His son called him father. He acknowledged that this man had taken care of him and provided for him. But the son wanted to spread his wings, we might say. Let me ask you a question. with all the experience the father may have had, do you think he could see where this was going? His son comes to him and says, "Dad, give me what's coming to me." And he sees him start packing up his bags. I think the dad knew what his son had in mind. But he was willing to let his son go. Why? Why was he willing to let his son leave and go to a faraway country, knowing what he had in mind to do? How many times have we seen our children start to do something that we know is going to result in falling flat on their faces, still let them do that? The father refused his request. The father could have forced his son to stay. Do we know some people like that like to keep everyone under their thumb? That you're going to do exactly what I say, when I say it, how I say it, and there is not going to be any more talk about it. Had the authority to say, "No, you're not." But why would he let him go? Until the son changed his heart and his spirit, there was nothing the father could do that was going to be profitable for the situation. When you have two hard forces that collide, you're going to have a mess to clean up. The father knew that his son was determined to leave. And if he had forced him to stay, nobody would have benefited at all. As painful as it is, we must let our children learn the consequences of decisions made. That's why we let them fall on their faces. That's why the father let his son leave with his inheritance. Because he had a lesson to learn that wasn't going to be learned through conversation alone. It was only going to be learned through experience. But we have our own excuses, don't we? We want to shield our children. We want to protect them. We want to insulate them from all this terrible stuff that's going on in the world. And there is a lot of terrible stuff that we really don't want our children to participate in, to even see or acknowledge happening. But what do we do when we act like this? We're doing nothing but coddling our children. Are we really helping them for when they are going to have to make their own decisions in the future by shielding them and insulating them? We're really not. Now, does this mean we throw them to the wolves? No. As parents, we offer guidance and we offer advice, our own experiences, hoping that they will learn from that and making their own decisions. To let our children learn consequences is not being unloving, and yet that is what society would have us to think. That when you let your children reap that which they have sown, when you could have prevented it, that's not a loving parent. But in fact, it's quite the opposite. It is loving our children to let them learn. But it's important to note as we go on through this parable here that he didn't just let his son go. We don't know how long the son was gone, honestly. It doesn't take us long to read this parable, does it? Just a couple minutes to read all the verses. We don't really get a feel for how long the son was really gone, but there's some key phrases that we can pick up on. In verse 13, it says, he wasted his possessions with prodigal living. He had enough time to spend the inheritance that his father had given him, whatever that amount was. He had enough time to burn through it. It also says in verse 14, but when he had spent all, there arose a severe famine in that land, and he began to be in want. He was gone long enough for a famine to affect the country that he was in, to the point where there wasn't much left. Famines don't happen overnight, necessarily. They take a while to build. As they're building, the effects become more dramatic. He was gone long enough, in verse 15, that he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. So here he is. He's wasted all his inheritance. Natural disaster hits, a famine. He has no way to provide for himself, has no food to eat. He goes and he hires himself out as a farmhand, basically, to where he's working for a stranger feeding hogs. And he would gladly have filled his stomach, verse 16, with the pods that the swine ate, and no one gave him anything. Even with his job, he wasn't getting what he needed. He was barely making by with what he had. And so what does he decide? Verse 17, when he came to himself, when he got to thinking and he said, you know what? I've messed up. I have royally messed things up. My father's servants had it better than what I have it now. They were treated with respect. They had food in their belly, clothes on their backs. And here I am wishing I was eating what the hogs are eating. I'm going to go back. And I'm going to admit my wrong. And I'm going to hope that my father will take me back even as a servant. Just hire me back as a servant, and I know I'm going to have it better than what I have now. What was the father doing while his son was gone? Remember, it seems like a good amount of time has passed. We're not talking a week. I mean, we could actually be looking at, years here before his son came to himself and decided he needed to go home. He was looking as a father. He was looking for his son. Verse 20, the second part. Actually, that's not verse 20. I have the wrong one. No, it is verse 20. I was looking at the wrong one. And he arose and came to his father, but when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. Imagine the father for years looking out his front door, hoping to see the silhouette of his son crest the ridge. Imagine the father every day hoping, is today the day he comes home? Maybe just wanting to hear a word that he's still alive, that he's okay. He had hope that was based on love for his son. He still loved his son deeply. And that love allowed him to hope that there would one day be a time when he would be coming home, walking through that front door. The way in which the Father responded when he saw his Son is in keeping with one who was watching intently for his return. It says he had compassion. Imagine how the Son must have looked, returning from his dismal conditions. He hasn't been living a high life. He's been a farmhand slopping the hogs. It says he had compassion. The Greek word for compassion is splanchnizomai. That was one of my favorite Greek words whenever I was in Greek class. It's just a fun word to say. But the meaning is being moved in the inner parts of the body. You see, the ancients thought of compassion as originating in the innermost parts, whereas today we may say we feel it in our heart. To them, you felt it in your gut. That is where compassion originated. This word is often used with Jesus and the response that he had towards those in the paltry conditions that they were in. When Scripture tells us that Jesus would be moved with compassion, he had a gut feeling towards those that he was around. Remember the parable of the gracious master and the servant in Matthew chapter 18. The master comes to the servant and says, "You owe me this much." And the servant says, "I am not able to pay you. Have mercy." And it says the master was moved with compassion towards the servant. The story of the Good Samaritan. A man is attacked and robbed, left for dead on the side of the road. 3 different individuals pass by, see him. 2 of them decide, "I don't want to mess with this. I'm going to go over here to the other side of the road and just keep on walking by." The Samaritan, it says, showed compassion towards the individual. Compassion is an emotion that leads to an appropriate response. It's not just a feeling. When Jesus had compassion, it wasn't just him saying, "I feel sorry for these folks," and then going about his way. The Good Samaritan didn't wag his head and say, "Boy, that guy's got it rough, but I need to get on down the road." They acted on what they saw appropriately. The Father, in seeing his Son, has compassion on him. So what do you think that is going to lead him to do? He's going to act. Although his son had wasted everything and had conducted his life in a reprobate manner, the Father was ready to help. And so what does he do next? After having compassion, it says he ran. In the latter half of verse 20. So what's the big deal about that? He ran. Doesn't really mean a whole lot to us. He was excited, right? In the first century, especially first century Palestine, men of a certain age did not run. I kind of like that. I agree with that wholeheartedly. Do not run. But it was looked down upon for men to run. It was neither respectable nor proper conduct. Men don't run. That's uncouth to do so. What could he have done? Well, if he's like a lot of fathers today, he just would have stood there at the door, watching his son make that long walk of shame up the driveway, just shaking his head. "I told you, boy. But But you wouldn't listen. Isn't that how a lot of fathers respond today? You made your bed, now lay in it. I mean, at the very least, he could have walked at a socially acceptable pace. It's like, okay, he's excited to see his son coming. Societal norms dictate that I don't run, so I'm just going to walk, and wherever I meet him is where I'm going to meet him. The father cared not for social mores when it came to his son. He did not care what was proper. He did not care what was socially acceptable. Picture the son full of shame, on his knees, desiring forgiveness, wanting to have the position of a servant in his own father's house. And his father runs to him. Why? Not to say, I told you so, but to give that forgiveness that the son has been desperately wanting. He ran because he loved his son. And he was happy to see him come back. He was happy that he had come to his senses and realized the mistakes he had made. And he said, you could just imagine him saying, my boy, I'm glad you are home. But after running to his son, he fell on his neck and kissed him. Embrace. Touch is sometimes hard between a father and a son. It's not viewed as very manly, right? To have an embrace. Maybe a fist bump or the guy hug, is all that exists between a father and a son. This father expressed his true feelings for how he felt. If you look and it says that he fell on his neck, what that demonstrates is the son had taken a position of being on his knees. The son had taken a position of submission to his father. The father very easily could have walked up to him and put his hand on his shoulder or put his hand on his head and said, son, I love you. But the father says, that's not enough. My son is on his knees, recognizing the mistakes he's made. I am going to go up and I am going to throw myself on him and I am going to join him on my knees because my boy's home. A hug and a kiss shared between father and son is not a sign of weakness, but rather it's a sign of the special bond that they share. Fathers and sons, if you're listening, never be ashamed to hug each other. Give each other a kiss on the cheek. Never be ashamed of doing that. Because you share a bond as father and son that you do not share with anybody else. It's a bond that cannot be replicated. And it's a bond that you are going to want much later in life. When I was in my early and mid-20s, just freshly married, out on my own, I was man of the house. I was top dog. Do you know how many times I needed to call my dad? Say, this is new to me. I've never done this before. Dad has a few years on me, a lot more experience. And he was willing and he was ready to help. because we had that bond. But after he welcomed the son back, after he let his son come back home, he gave him a home. Let's read verses 22 through 24 again. But the father said to the servants, "Bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand, and sandals on his feet, and bring the fatted calf here, and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead, and is alive again. He was lost, and is found." And they began to be merry. Too many parents demand that their children deserve forgiveness before forgiving them. You got to earn your way back into this home. And it's not limited to parents and children. We do that with each other, with everyone else. You have to earn my forgiveness before I'll give it to you. The father welcomed his son back by reminding him that he was his son. He gave him the best robe. Imagine what the son looked like again. Coming out of the fields of a famine-ravished country, having traveled back home, he was probably in rags. He would have loved to have had a hand-me-down robe, something to cover himself with, and his father says, "Bring out the best and give it to him." He said, "Take a ring and put it on his hand." This isn't just something for bling, something for fashion. These were signet rings, family rings. You've heard of family crests, right? Families would have symbols that represented who they were. In the first century, they much had the same thing. Each family had their own crest that designated who they were. They would seal documents with it. It would identify them as being part of this family. The significance of placing a ring on his hand goes so much further than just, "I want you to look presentable." But he's saying, "You are part of this family again. You have come back as my son. I am accepting you as my son. And to prove it, here's your ring." He said, "Take the sandals and put them on his feet," indicating that he was barefoot. He didn't have anything on his feet. Traveling a long way, working the fields, he didn't have much in the way of footwear. The father was once again providing for his son, giving him what he needed. It also demonstrates a position of honor. Most of the time, servants didn't wear sandals as they were working around their master's house. Those who lived in the house, those who were of the family, they did wear the sandals. Remember, the son desired to just become a servant for his father. "Make me as a servant, and I'll be happy." And the father says, "You're more than a servant. You're my son. And I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to clothe you. I'm going to put sandals on your feet. And we're going to kill the fatted calf and eat it." We've got the barbecue coming up at Mike's house next month. Looking forward to it. There's going to be a lot of good meat there to eat. With good meat comes good fellowship. Imagine how hungry the son was. longing to eat the scraps that he was feeding the hogs. I would be happy with that, he says. He could have come home and the father could have said, there's a pot of stew in the kitchen there. Just go help yourself, get you a bowl, tear you off a chunk of bread, just sit down and eat. I'm sure you're hungry. The father gives his son the best. These fatted calves were often reserved for great times of joy. If there was a prominent visitor coming through and they were staying with you, you would fix the fatted calf for them. Times of feasting was when the fatted calf would be used. We don't know what he was saving this calf for. A fellow student of mine in school had a very interesting hypothesis. And it can't be proven from the text, but it kind of fits with other aspects of the text. It takes a while to fatten a calf up, doesn't it? It takes a while to get them to that position. What if he had been planning for his son to come back all alone? What if, along with looking out the window every day, hoping to see his son come over the hill, that he was also feeding that calf every day, fattening it up, waiting for the opportunity, hoping that they would be able to use that calf for when his son finally came home. Like I said, it's an interesting hypothesis. It does fit with other aspects within the text of how much the father cared for his son, even though he had decided to walk away. But whether this calf was designed for this son or whether it had another purpose, the father still said, we're going to celebrate because my son is home. My son was dead and is alive again, he said. He was lost and is found. If that isn't a reason to celebrate, I don't know what is. To have one that you thought was lost forever, not knowing whether he was breathing or not. Technology allows us to keep in constant communication with loved ones, thousands of miles apart on the other side of the world. They weren't as fortunate back then. They didn't even have the USPS. And so to get word to someone was quite the undertaking. And the son had no desire to communicate once he spread his wings out. And so to the father, he was as good as dead. But he said, he has been made alive. The son was restored. Not brought in and told to sit here in the back. Not brought in and said, I want you to stay over here in this wing of the house because you've brought a lot of shame on us, son. And I'm glad you're back and all, but you need to sit over there. The son had displayed a penitent and changed heart. And the father recognized that. Why else would the son had made the journey back home? But that he had changed his mind and recognized that he was wrong. And the father said, that is good enough for me, son. You have come to your senses, you have come back, and I am overjoyed. As fathers, we have a great and difficult responsibility. We have the souls of our children to look out for. We have our children to raise in the Lord. Ephesians 6 and verse 4. We will hurt when we see our children make mistakes. And they are going to make them. knowing that had they heeded our advice, the outcome would have been different. We try to educate our children. We try to prepare them for the decisions that lie ahead of them. We try to counsel them as they're going over the bumps in the road. But they're not always going to listen to what we have to say. We cannot live their lives for them. And a lot of parents try to do that. A lot of fathers try to live their children's lives. But when our children display a change of heart as the prodigal son, we must be like his father and welcome them back with open arms. I know a lot of us here have children that aren't really to this age yet. Most of the children here are younger. Some are getting ready to go out and spread their wings. But we all have a responsibility as fathers to do the best that we can for our children. When Mom and Dad came over to help move and unpack, we thank them many times for their help. Mom loves spending time with the grandkids, I know. But Dad came over and he broke a sweat, helping me move some of the bigger stuff around. He took my to-do list from this long to a much more manageable size. When I told him I appreciated him and loved him for coming over, he said, "Son, we do what we can do when we can do it." As fathers, that should be our mentality, that we will do what we can do when we can do it. How much more does our Heavenly Father desire our return? Romans 3:23 says, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We all are going to make the decision to walk away from God in our lives. Does He just write us off at that point and say, well, there's another one gone? 1 Timothy 2 verse 4 tells us that God desires all men to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. God is looking for each of His children to come home. Just like the prodigal son's father looked for his son over the horizon, God is looking for each one of us to come home. Luke 15 verse 7 says, there is much joy in heaven over one sinner repenting than 99 just people. When that one decides to come home to God, in essence, he's killing the fatted calf. He is joyful that we have decided to return. He wants us back and will receive us with open arms. How do we get back home? Once we make that decision to leave God and to go spread our wings on earth, the prodigal son knew what he had to do to get home. He just walked the same road back. This is the road God has given us to come home. And when we follow this path, what a glorious home it will lead to. Hearing and believing are essential to what one has to do to come home. For one thing, if you don't hear it, how are you going to know what to do? Right? And if you don't believe it, then what's the point of going any further? But once you believe that God is ready to accept you back, to make you as one of His children, then we have to do as the prodigal son did, and we have to change our lives. He couldn't live in the far-off country maintaining his hedonistic lifestyle and be right with his Father, he had to change. He repented of what he had done, and he came back. And when we do that and we acknowledge that Jesus died for our sins, and we confess that we need him in order to come home, then we are ready for baptism. Baptism is the door that brings us into God's house. When you are lowered down into that body of water and you come up, you are now one of God's redeemed children. The joy that the prodigal son's father felt when his son came home does not compare to the joy God experiences when we decide to come home. Are you ready to make that decision today? Are you ready today to come home? To once again claim God as your Father and to start living your life for him. If you are in need of baptism, we are ready to assist you in that. We will see to it that it is done before you leave. If you would like prayers for strength, for forgiveness, if you are an erring child of God, and you would like prayers for repentance and for forgiveness, ready to walk through that door again into God's house, we will be more than happy to pray with you and for you to that end. The decision is yours. The invitation is the Lord's. Make your decision now as we stand.